Ecology and economics. Both words come from the Greek word oikos, which means household. Today, ecology typically refers to the study of nature's household, and economics refers to humankind's household. However, the two are deeply interconnected, and viewing them in isolation has led to disastrous results. With our aging infrastructure, a human population that is rapidly expanding, and increased competition for scarce resources, it is more important than ever for our economic systems to recognize the value of ecosystem services. The study of ecological economics provides a practical pathway to integrate the natural and social sciences to build a more sustainable future. So we are thrilled tonight to have Dr. Erickson with us to tell us more about this fascinating field of study. Dr. Erickson is a professor of ecological economics and is the interim dean of the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. He has published widely on energy and climate change policy, land conservation, watershed planning, environmental public health, and of course, the theory and practice of ecological economics. He is also an Emmy Award-winning producer of films, including a 4-part PBS series called Bloom, that explores the sources and solutions to pollution on Lake Champlain in Vermont. It is a fantastic documentary, and you can watch it online at bloomthemovie.org. I really learned a lot from the series, and I highly recommend watching it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jon Erickson.
Thanks so much. That was nice. All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction and the warm welcome. I'm thrilled to be here to help kick off this series. Yeah, wow, a lot of people came out on a cold night. This is really good news for the planet. There's a lot of caring people. So I'd like to talk to you about a new kind of economics. I'd like to talk to you tonight about moving our economic system towards something that we share in widely in an economic system that's designed for a finite world. So the title of this talk could be just the reverse, I guess, if I was a normal economist, right? So an economic system where we take our resources and we squander them away to the very few, and an economic system that thinks that we live in an infinite world. So I'd like to flip that on its head. What I'd like to do tonight is just lay out a broad problem statement that I think will help frame a number of the resource and environmental and integrated economic challenges that we have before us. I'd like to talk about the solution to most of our problems is the problem itself. The solution has become the problem. And then we could really get into sort of what we call a pre-analytic vision. Before you do analysis, either as an ecologist or an economist or any discipline, what is your view of how you think the world works? Economics has a very different view than the rest of science. And I think it's really important to come to terms with that pre-analytic vision and have a new starting point for an economics for the 21st century. And then we'll come back around to the main theme of tonight's talk, which is how we're going to move from a system obsessed with economic growth and move to a system that's really concerned with genuine development, a system that's obsessed with quantity towards a system that really is oriented around quality. So where we'll start with is defining a triple crisis. Now, if you watch the news, watch CNN, BBC, Fox, ABC, NBC, whatever news that you watch, the triple crisis, what would, if you had three big things that we seem to be obsessed about in the news these days, what would that be? What is it?
The economy, the economy, the economy.
The economy, the economy, and the economy. Good. That seems to be the triple crisis. Let's unpack that a bit. What is it about the economy that we're worried about? Employment. I heard what? Taxes? Money. So in debt, right? We hear a lot about debt. Spending, debt, money, all of these things seem to be the focus of our economy. And the triple crisis might be debt, might be government spending, might be kind of an unemployment problem, right? This jobless recovery that we seem to be in. And the solution to this triple crisis is what? More, right? More growth. We got to grow the economy. All our models, all our policies, everything depends upon some kind of getting back to some kind of normal growth rate, and we can grow our way out of a debt problem, grow our way out of a spending problem, grow our way out of an unemployment problem, okay? So you know, the holy grail of the triple crisis is economic growth. I'm going to make the case that we're in a different triple crisis. The real triple crisis is indeed economic, okay? So we have some serious economic issues. The structure of our economy, the function of our economy, this debt-based monetary system that we've created that sort of all points to a system that really requires infinite growth to work, to function. This is a problem when we think about the other parts of my triple crisis, okay? Which is also a resource crisis and an environmental crisis. So I want to spend a little time unpacking that and then getting back to that notion of, you know, is economic growth going to solve these three things? So let's start with the economic crisis. Certainly we are taking on some debt. Okay, this is an historical view of our debt, looking at the Congressional Budget Office data, going all the way back to estimates at the U.S. Revolution through these various periods of time in our society. And we are somewhere up in here in 2012, 2013, approaching World War II levels of debt, where we peaked above, okay, it was the highest sort of debt ratio in our country's history, 109% of GDP. So we grew our way out of the Great Depression. We spent a lot of money. World War II helped us get out of the Great Depression, and we did so by borrowing a lot of money. And then we paid it off, right? We paid it off through growth. Thank you. All right, you guys are starting to catch on here. We grew, right? We grew like crazy. We grew the largest middle class that the world had ever seen. We grew the largest economy that the world had ever seen. We did this growth through an amazing combination of labor productivity, technology, resource exploitation, trade. We grew, and we paid back this debt. And then it started to pile up again, and then we get into the Great Recession, and we've really taken on some debt, and there's some various projections here of going forward that aren't all that rosy on the debt scenario side of things. This is where we are now in 2011, 2012. You know, if you look at our outlays, so how much our government is spending versus the revenues that it takes in, we've got this growing gap. So in modern times, really going back to 1971 here, we have this growing gap. And we're going to fix it through growth. Okay, so we're going to grow. We're going to grow. So all of these CBO estimates includes growth that brings our revenues back up. And then we're going to control some of our spending, control some of our costs, but we're largely going to fix this through growth. This is how we sort of grew out of that last major debt buildup coming out of World War II. Is we redistributed huge sums of wealth in our country throughout society, right? We did it in sort of a shared way. We grew in a very middle America way. We took wealth, so pre-Great Depression, we've never seen wealth levels that was concentrated in the hands of so few, right? 44% estimate wealth in 1% of the U.S. population. The Great Depression sort of broke that bubble, as the Great Recession did this time around. We were seeing similar numbers coming into the Great Recession. A lot of us were going, uh-oh. If you just rocked the boat on this 1% of America, we could see a huge bubble burst here. And that wealth, you know, still 21% of the country's wealth in 1% of hands. You know, some people still might think that's a lot. 81 was a game changer for our country, and we flipped the switch and we went back the other way. Okay, so we started to concentrate wealth in the hands of the few, and we did this in a very purposeful way, a policy designed way. You guys all heard of trickle-down economics and the kinds of policy changes that we did to say our growth model now for the 80s and 90s is going to be to really sort of stack the deck in favor of a wealthy class. If you look at this in terms of income, so here is 1947, post-World War II to 1979, some analysis by Michel and Bernstein. Break the U.S. population up into equal quintiles, and you see that period, you know, we grew fairly in a sort of equitable way, right? Each of these 20 percentiles of people was growing on the order of, and this is in real dollars, so taking out inflation, 160%, 114%. In fact, the wealthiest groups here were growing the least. And here you break out the top 5%, and the growth was smaller than all of these other quintiles. So 1979, 1980, magic time here in our country's history. We flipped the switch, okay? This is what it looked like throughout the 80s and throughout the 90s into the better part of the last decade. The lower quintiles are either not keeping up or barely keeping up in real terms, so keeping up with inflation. And a lot of the growth of incomes that we saw in our country was really in that top 5%. Quite a different story than the growth model coming out of World War II. We also, in this more recent period of growth, saw major productivity gains. But that productivity wasn't widely shared across the economy because we saw real hourly compensation and real hourly earnings either flatten or decline. So real here is a term that's used to sort of say take inflation out, right? Really get a sense of what your earnings can really buy for you. And real hourly earnings, when you don't worry about all the other compensation on top of earnings, has been in decline really since the mid-70s. Yet productivity is going up and up and up and up and up. So where does the extra return on labor going? What is happening to it? If it's not going to the worker, if it's not going to the wage, where is this extra sort of productivity of this amazing growth experiment of the United States economy going?
Management and stockholders.
Management and stockholders. So one of the switches that we flipped, right, was to really gear our tax towards rewarding capital gains, right, and really punishing labor gains. And so that was one of the sort of things that happened and why we saw that really lopsided growth pattern happen as compared to post-World War II up to 79, 80, and ever since. This really relates to the second crisis, the resource crisis. Because the other way, the miracle of the growth system, the U.S. growth economy post-World War II, was energy. Our country, our nation had more oil resources than any other country in the history of the economy, the history of the planet. We had the most, and we also blew through it the fastest. And we were really good at this. And we had energy resources that piled high, really helped us grow our way out of that huge debt burden that we had taken on leading up to World War II. So I want to tell you a bit about that story and how that's changing as well. This is some industry analysis. Energy data is so hard to come by because it's all controlled by industry and or national industry, which is even harder to get some of that data. So you got to wring this out of the energy consultants. But this is energy production per capita looking across the world, okay? So it's growing until about 1979, and we've seen this kind of plateau for energy production per capita. Now you might say, well, that's no big deal. We can grow without more energy because we're becoming more efficient, right? We're becoming more efficient. I'm going to break that myth here in a second. Also, if you look at world energy production, so this is energy production per capita, world energy production stopped growing exponentially by 1970. Okay, and this is a really interesting sort of break in our country and the world's history as we have become, I will argue, more dependent on energy than ever before, yet it's not growing exponentially anymore. Yet GDP continued to grow exponentially throughout the 80s and throughout the 90s. Population continued to grow exponentially, but energy's not keeping up anymore. Okay, so this is going to have to somehow affect the growth model of the 80s and 90s versus the growth model of the 50s and 60s. Part of the story, of course, is the peaking of oil supplies. So we've done thorough analysis of the big oil producers throughout the world, and you see these years when all of these countries, the U.S. outside of Alaska peaked in 1971, as M. King Hubbard said it would back in the 1950s. You add Alaska, we peaked at 89. Of course, with the current oil prices, we're getting into a new kind of peak, and I'll talk about that in a second. All of these other major oil countries have peaked, and have extended recently this peak oil curve out a little bit farther, but through very unconventional oil supplies. The good stuff, the stuff where you just stuck a straw in the ground and it was easy to get up, is going fast. And the cheap oil supplies are in limited supply, and they're only in certain parts of the world, and they're not here. We burn through the cheap stuff. If you look at this in a little more detailed, this is what you would call a marginal cost curve. So what does it cost to get that next unit of oil out of the ground? Okay, that next unit of crude out of the ground. The cheap stuff, okay, the stuff that's still costing about $20 to $30 a barrel to get out, is in this part of the world. Saudi Arabia, Middle East, the Russian Federation. Of all of this oil, the only place in the world that has any slack in production right now, perhaps, is Russia. Meaning that Russia could turn the spigot up a little bit more if they wanted to. Everybody else is flat out, flat out. And this is the cheap stuff. The oil prices we're seeing today, right, we're starting to see a business as usual scenario for a barrel of oil now is hovering between that $95 and $110 a barrel. So that is making it now economical to go after things like the tar sands, to go after various deep water oil. When oil was hovering around $40 or $50 a barrel, that stuff just wasn't coming online. Those new oil sources are really coming online, and are coming online strong at these high oil prices. And it's helping us sort of extend those peak oil curves, those just a little bit farther, but in an interesting way. This is the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, and this is their scenario, looking at the world's oil and gas liquids, going out here, and they're estimating the peak somewhere in the range that we are now, and we have been able to stretch some of these resources. But this oil is not like our grandparents' oil. Okay, this oil is tough to get, and it's taking more and more energy to get. And I know you're going to be talking about fracking at a later date in this seminar, but it's also much more costly to get in water, in soil, in all kinds of things that are coming into play of how are we going to go and get this oil. This is not your grandparents' oil or your father's oil. This is a new kind of oil that, when you really are honest about it, the net oil that we're going to get looks like a much steeper cliff on the other side. Now, what I mean by net here is you have to account for how much energy you have to put into the system and how much energy you get out of the system. Okay? The miracle of the U.S. growth economy coming out of the post-World War II time was that we had oil resources that had ratios of 90 and 80, and maybe some of our marginal resources were 70 to 1. One unit of energy in, and you're getting 70 or 60 or 80 out. Okay? Some of these marginal oil fields that we're going after now, you're lucky if you get 4 to 1. Ethanol, 1 unit in, maybe 1.1 out. Right? Wind, solar, nuclear, all of these things have energy ratios 15 or lower. So we're trying to now sort of keep up with energy demands and rig a new system that is not going to reproduce the magic of oil. I can't believe I'm standing here saying the magic of oil. But it's true. I mean, oil was an unbelievable thing for us. You know, as is coal, as is natural gas. The days are over, and what we're facing is a real sort of net energy cliff. Not a peak oil cliff, right? You can't think of this just in terms of the aggregate amount. You got to think that all of this energy is required to get this last piece out. So let me show you how this looks like. A colleague of mine, Charlie Hall from the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, has really spent a career doing what's called energy return on energy invested analysis. So these are various EROI estimates for different kinds of energy resources. And hydro is fantastic. Okay, you get upwards of 100 to 1 for big scale hydro. 1 energy in, 100 out. Hydro's got other problems. But when you put all that infrastructure in, you get for a good amount of time a lot of energy out. And hydro certainly has that going for it. You know, coal resources. You know, we're going to go to coal. We are going to coal in a big way because 1 energy in gets you 80 out. World oil production back 30 years ago was 40 to 1. Now it's looking at closer to 20 to 1. Wind, maybe I've seen estimates in the range of 15 to 20 to 1. Oil imports in 2005, oil and gas, oil imports 2007. You see that we're starting to slide down this net energy cliff. We're going to more and more marginal resources that require more energy in than you're getting back out in return. Photovoltaic, shale oil, ethanol, biodiesel, ethanol corn is just pitiful on energy returns. Yet we're subsidizing the hell out of these kinds of choices, right? To squeeze as much energy out by putting a lot of energy in. We're burning natural gas to get ethanol. We're burning stuff that's up here and the energy return to produce stuff that's down here, just because of the way we've rigged the economic system. I could talk about energy all night, but I'm going to start to shift gears here. This is my last curve. This is what we thought was supposed to happen. So this through the 1980s and 90s, you've got total energy is the red line, and you've got real, so adjusted for inflation, GDP is the blue line. We were hoping to see this separation, right? The economy continues to grow, but it requires less and less energy to do so per unit of growth. The problem is these curves are starting to come together and grow together again because we are moving towards these marginal energy resources. We never really took into account the sort of biophysical realities of sticking the straw in the ground and going after and getting those really, really marginal resources, right? It's just physics, gang. It's going to require a lot more energy to get the energy out than it used to. So when we saw the sort of financial crisis of 2008, we were seeing other articles around sort of questioning the ability to grow our way out of this current crisis, right? And sort of questioning the ability to go back to the old growth model because of limits on resources, because of sort of questioning what do you get from growth. We're seeing all kinds of headlines coming out in 2008, 2009 that's really starting to put a hard spotlight on the growth model. Is the growth model going to work this time around? Are we going to be able to grow our way out of our debt, grow our way out of our spending, grow our way out of our employment problem? Or are we really sort of running out of planet to exploit? Okay, in the words of a Nobel laureate in economics, Paul Krugman, The Folly of Growth. World is facing natural resources crunch, just like a financial crunch. So this is really the sort of resource crisis side of the equation that's intimately connected to the economic crisis side of the equation. And I would argue why we're seeing a jobless recovery, more record-breaking productivity, but we're having a hard time keeping up with the energy resources. I want to get to the environmental crisis piece of the puzzle here because we can't ignore the fact that we might want to leave some, if not most, of this carbon in the ground. Okay? We can't forget about, so we could go down lots of different roads to talk about the environmental crisis. We could talk about water, we could talk about soils, we could talk about air. I'm going to talk about climate, okay? And I'm going to borrow from our colleague in Vermont, Bill McKibben, who I think has written the most eloquently and pulled together the most science. It's unbelievable how he sort of synthesizes the science on climate change. And hopefully you saw this piece in a Rolling Stone magazine last year about this sort of scary, terrifying new math of global warming. And if you didn't, I want to throw 3 numbers at you, okay, to really get you to think about how the environmental crisis very much relates to this resource crisis. The first number is the number 2. McKibben fans, what's the number 2? Anybody? What's the number 2 have to do about the environmental crisis? 2 degrees, good guess. 2 degrees Celsius, okay? So the majority of climate scientists think that we're already committed to a 2 degrees Celsius increase in average global temperatures, okay? And they also think that, and this is one of the outcomes of our recent international meeting, that we should try to sort of figure out how to stick to and not go above 2 degrees Celsius, because the science consensus is that 2 degrees is going to be tough enough. If you go much beyond that, there's some scenarios that we just don't want to think about. Right now, we're already at 0.8 degrees Celsius. And with 0.8 degrees Celsius, we've already seen we've lost 1/3 of Arctic summer ice. Our oceans are 30% more acidic. We've got the atmosphere above our oceans is now holding 5% more water moisture, which is really fueling these big storm events that are staring us in the face. Here in Illinois, last year, you guys broke 150 temperature records, right? July was the hottest month ever recorded in the Northern Hemisphere. We just do the math, right? We have to be honest about the mathematics here. We have to be honest about physics. We have to be honest about what 99% of the climate scientists are telling us about climate change, and to try and not break this number 2. To not break the 2 degrees Celsius increase, we have to think about the second number, okay? We've only got about 565 gigatons of carbon dioxide that we could put up in the atmosphere and stay under that 2 degree threshold. Okay, 565 gigatons. A gigaton is 1 billion tons, so 565 billion tons. Okay? That sounds like a lot. I don't know. It sounds like a big number, right? Well, we're currently growing, okay, at a rate of 3% more emissions each year. All right, that's our annual growth rate as a globe. So it's not like we're leveling off. It's not like we're shrinking. We're growing at 3% a year. At 3% a year growth, call it a business as usual scenario, right? We'll blow through that 565 budget in 16 years. So 16 years at current growth rates, we'll blow through that budget, and we'll be at the number that most climate scientists are saying, this is roughly about how much carbon you got left, gang, to use. All right? To stay below that 2 degree threshold. The third number is the scariest of all. 2,795. 2,795 gigatons of carbon that we know we have in reserves. Oil, coal, and gas. Okay? This isn't the sort of guesstimates of what we think we could have if the prices were right and we could go even find more of the unconventional fossil fuels. But this is what is on the books of our private fossil fuel companies and our nationalized fossil fuel companies. Okay? At a minimum, we've got 5 times the amount that the climate scientists are saying, don't go beyond this. Okay? We've got 5 times the amount. Whew. That's a scary prospect. So all those peak oil and peak fuel graphs I'm showing and all the sort of stuff that we have left to blow through, we can't blow through that, or we're going to blow through this climate. So what next? Where do we go from here? How do we change the model? Our politics and our dialogue and our national economics seems to be driven by a conversation around debt, government spending, unemployment. The solution to these things is economic growth, and I can't come to a different conclusion than economic growth is simply going to exacerbate our economic crisis, our resource crisis, and our environmental crisis. This solution is probably not even going to work to solve these things because of declining energy return on investment. So the energy resources that we have to grow with are not our grandparents' energy resources. And if we do it in the way we've been doing, growing 3% more CO2 emissions, more greenhouse gas emissions a year, we're heading towards this climate cliff, and we've got 16 years to get off that growth path. Our civilization was built for the Holocene. Our civilization was built for this period of relative climate stability that we find ourselves in. Our agriculture, our government systems, everything we know was sort of built for the Holocene. The question now is, how can we survive the Anthropocene? This is what geologists are calling this age that we live in now, okay? woohoo, we are super species, right? We have an epoch named after people, the Anthropocene, right? We have affected the Earth so much that we now have our own epoch. And can we survive it is the question. How are we going to do it? How are we going to change our economic system, especially get off of this, which is the hardest thing to ever imagine getting off of, because we fundamentally depend on economic growth to solve so many of our problems. How are we going to get off economic growth? So let me flip this on its head now. Growth or development? Okay, and this really kind of goes to the early roots of an ecological economics, an economics that says, yeah, maybe it made sense to sort of create an economic system, a study of economics, an economic policy signals that encouraged growth in our infancy, right? And to build a model in the 19th and 20th century that wanted to grow more of the sort of human artifacts, right? At the expense of everything else. But as we move into a 21st century economics, should we be moving more towards an economics of resilience, of restoration, of stability, of steady state versus a growth economy? And how are we going to do that? And are our tools that were largely developed in the 1930s and 40s that tell us to grow and measure growth outdated? This was a nice piece a few years ago in the New York Times Magazine that really was called The Rise and Fall of GDP, Gross Domestic Product, How We Measure Growth. And the piece sort of has this caricature of economically high GDP man is superior to low GDP man, right? A bigger boon to his country, but is his life any better, right? So high GDP man, right, works long hours, his or her spouse probably works as well, you know, they send their kids to daycare, they never take vacations. When their parents get old and frail, they spend money by sending them away too. They don't take any leisure time. They work. They are the economic citizen, right? And they are contributing hugely to their economy by doing so. Low GDP man, you know, he's out here hanging out, peanut butter and jelly sandwich and drinking local beer and like taking time off and spending time with his family and maybe volunteering for his community and working for the local Watershed association, and like he's a bum, right? I mean, he's not an economic citizen. He's not doing his part. So this is this caricature that the New York Times creates, this sort of question: do we get the right metrics for the 21st century? You know, are we counting the right thing here? And how should we sort of retool our economic policy to move us towards, if it's the wrong thing, move us towards the right thing? Now, this is how we calculate GDP, okay? This is a national income accounting system, and we take the world, and this is sort of chapter 1 of any economics textbook, and we break the world up into firms and households, and we have these various flows, okay? And up here, there are various payment flows from firms to households, and firms basically pay wages on labor, they pay income on capital, they pay rent on land, and they pay profits on entrepreneurship. And that's one way of calculating GDP, gross domestic product. And it's a beautiful system. It's a double book accounting system because you also can add it up on the consumption side. So the biggest part of GDP is personal consumption, so all the money that we all spend on our sort of consumption on an annual basis. Business investment, so business consumption, the money that businesses have to invest in themselves to create the capacity to make more stuff the next time period for us to consume. Government expenditures, and if you're looking at our national economy, the net of imports and exports, that's also GDP. And this sort of money consumption circle goes round and round and round and round and round and round and round. This is the kind of pre-analytic vision of modern macroeconomics. It comes from the 1930s. Great Depression, leading up to the Great Depression, we had no macroeconomics. It was all about microeconomics, okay? Why would you need a macroeconomics? Because the idea of economics, of a laissez-faire economics, was hands-off, right? Let the market do its thing. Demanders, suppliers, scarcity, ups, downs, the price signals will basically adjust and manage the economy. Why do you need a government beyond just setting up the laws and the rules so that your markets can function efficiently? Out of the Great Depression come national income accounts. Out of World War II comes really detailed product and expenditure accounts so that the government could imagine how are we going to move an economy from peacetime to wartime back to peacetime again. So here come the economic planners, right? And you can imagine how that went over in economics circles back in the 1940s. The 50s and 60s, we've got the post-World War boom. Macroeconomics is really taking off. It's really born. We really have a Keynesian economics. We have sort of an excuse and a rationale for economists to tinker with the economy to make sure that we don't get stuck in deep ruts, that we manage the business cycles. We create these detailed input-output tables and capital stock estimates. In economics, a true sort of macroeconomics is born. The 60s and 70s, especially in the 70s, we're worried about accelerating inflation. So we revise and we adjust our sort of accounting system again to really get better estimates of price, to take out the price signal so that we can really measure real production, not just nominal production. 1980s, we see the internationalization of trade and services, right? So you really have to start to take this into account and the expansion of international trade in our national income accounts. This becomes a big part of sort of revising GDP accounts yet again. The 80s and 90s, information technology, expanding financial services. How do you measure the output of a service company versus a manufacturing company? How do you measure for quality, quality of different products? So GDP is revised again. GDP keeps changing, according to the life and times of the economists, right? We keep sort of revising and changing GDP. In the 2000s, we had a brief flurry of activity around climate change, natural resource scarcity, some work on green accounting. Some countries like Norway and Scandinavia in general went down the road of starting to produce satellite accounts to GDP that were starting to account for the depreciation of natural resources. Life and time of our economists, GDP changes again. So the question is, okay, coming out of the Great Recession, now what? Right? Do we have to sort of, is this the right tool? Do we just have to modify it a little bit? Do we have to throw it out altogether, or is it somewhere in between? And I'll sort of rely on this quote from Thomas Friedman, "The inflection is near," kind of reacting to the financial crisis, where Friedman says, what if this crisis represents something more fundamental than just a deep recession, right? What if it tells us that the whole growth model we created over the last 50 years is simply unsustainable economically and ecologically? And that 2008 was when we hit the wall, when Mother Nature and the market both said no more. So I want to pick that apart a little bit and see if we can come up with an alternative and come up with a way of revising the significant target to economic policy, GDP. What would something look like that contrasts the 1930s infinite planet dreaming, the context of grow at all costs, with the 2012, 2013 finite planet reality, sort of finally coming to terms with a finite planet. Are we now able to move from what you might call an empty world vision, where the size of the economy relative to the sustaining and containing ecosystem was quite small, to a full world vision, where the size of the economy relative to the sustaining and containing ecosystem is quite large? What are the trade-offs in the 21st century of economic growth that we could never have imagined in the 20th century, let alone the 19th century, where much of the body of our economic theory comes from? So this model is problematic, I would argue, for a number of reasons. It's especially problematic in a full world. It's especially problematic in a finite planet. It's especially problematic because it simply doesn't obey the laws of physics, okay? Anyone from the physics department in here? So some scientists in here, right? Have we figured out how to run a perpetual motion machine yet? If I missed the issue of Science Magazine or something? No? Okay. Well, we haven't figured it out yet, right? So, the problem with this model, of course, is it sort of doesn't have any fuel and it doesn't produce any waste. The problem with this model is the environment is in there, but it's sort of a sector within the firm box. There's like a coal sector, a waste sector, an oil sector. It sort of embeds the environment within the economy, and I don't know that that's a good starting point. It's a good pre-analytic vision, especially in the 21st century realities of a full planet. The real problem with this model is when we use GDP as a guide to our policy, it really has all kinds of sort of perverse outcomes. So for example, high crime rates historically have been fantastic for GDP. Okay, you got to spend money, right, on security and alarm systems, and I mean it's a whole birth of new industries because of high crime rates. Pollution is a great thing for GDP. You know, if we don't like pollution, we got to go clean it up. So you know, one of the booming areas of our country in recent years has been the Gulf Coast. All of the economic activity that's been created by cleaning up the oil spill. And all of the economic activity has been created by rebuilding after the Hurricane Katrina. Okay, the next big boom is going to be Jersey, New York, Connecticut, because we got to rebuild all that. Hurricanes are fantastic for GDP, right? We need more of these things, right? We just need to kind of keep rebuilding our economies all the time. Depletion of resources. When we deplete resources, okay, GDP goes up because we don't account for the depletion of natural capital as if it were a loss. It's only a benefit in GDP, right? You want to convert natural capital into income flows, GDP goes up. We want to deplete our soils, we want to deplete our oil stocks, we want to deplete our minerals. Okay, that's all good thing for GDP. Expand the work week. You know, that's a good thing. For when the work week goes up, GDP goes up, right? Why have maternity and paternity leave? That's horrible for our economy, right? That's terrible. Right? As soon as that kid pops out, you put him in daycare and you get back to work, damn it, right? That's a good economic citizen. That is what we want for a growing economy. And it turns out, and there's a lot of mixed messages here, and there's a lot of great research on whether higher inequality is good for GDP or bad, but the presumption has been that it's been good for GDP, right? That when we grow a very lopsided economy, okay, we're putting more wealth into the hands of people who know what to do with it, right? And they're going to grow the economy. And it's all those benefits are going to trickle down to the rest of us. This is a problematic worldview. We start in ecological economics with a different kind of pre-analytic vision. We put the box inside the circle. This is a very simple picture, right? It's not a very complicated model here. But this is Chapter 1 in an Ecological Economics textbook. We say the box goes inside the circle, the economy is inside the sustaining and containing ecosystem. The ecosystem, and therefore the economy, is run by solar energy, produces heat waste. Every time, all the economic system is a big converter of matter to waste, and energy to waste. And this system, unlike the previous picture, obeys the laws of physics. The first law of thermodynamics, right? Matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. Boo, there it is. Okay, that's good. Check. We got the first law in there. The second law of physics, right? The entropy law, right? All matter and energy tend towards higher and higher disorder, higher and higher entropy. In economics terms, lower and lower usefulness. Boo, it's in there, right? You got low entropy matter, low entropy energy that comes into the economic system. What has to come out the other end is high entropy matter, high entropy energy, or waste. And we can be really clever about how to sort of stage so that waste from one process is the input to another, and waste from that is the input to another. And there's a great, the Bioneers are fantastic about thinking about innovative ways of using waste as an input to another kind of economic process. But ultimately, you end up with waste. Can you recycle? Sure. It's going to require energy to do so, though, right? Can you recycle energy? Absolutely. Always requires more energy in than you get back out. It's kind of stupid to recycle energy. So we do make this choice of recycling matter. This box gives us economic services, but the rest of the circle gives us ecological services. In an empty world, where the box is small, maybe it made sense to just ignore these kinds of trade-offs and grow the box. In a full world, where the box is quite large, we start to get some greater clarity of what that ultimate trade-off is between an expanding economic system and a fixed ecological system. So this brings me to the sort of punchline. We have been working in the ecological economics community for, over 25 years now. New kinds of indicators, new ways of measuring well-being, new ways of measuring development that doesn't necessarily look like growth. We've been making the argument for a long time, to use the words of Herman Daly, that we moved beyond economic growth in our country a long time ago. Economic growth should be where the benefits are greater than the costs. Uneconomic growth is where the costs are greater than the benefits. You won't find that word in any economics textbook. There's no such thing as uneconomic growth. But there should be, right? We need to be thinking about what is that balance between the costs and benefits and what is the right size of the economy. How big should the box be inside the circle? That's the macroeconomics of the 21st century, in earth economics, right, in ecological economics. Micro foundations of microeconomics was the hallmark of the 19th and early 20th century. We move into a macroeconomics that's kind of built on the micro foundations. Now we're moving into really an earth economics. And the life and times of our economists are starting to change those kinds of indicators. What GPI does is it starts with personal consumption and it adjusts for inequality. It makes this sort of assumption that an extra dollar to a rich person doesn't create as much welfare, well-being as an extra dollar to a poor person. So it adjusts for inequality. And if you grow down a more inequitable path, you're going to get charged for it in this metric. It also sort of makes these kinds of adjustments for example, consumer durables. The miracle of the growth model of the 50s and 60s was that we sort of built in this notion of planned obsolescence to a lot of our consumer culture, right? We want things to sort of wear out and be replaced all the time. That's good for the economy. In an empty world, maybe. In a full world, not so sure. We've got to get into our bookkeeping system the costs of growth. We don't grow into a vacuum. We don't grow into a void. The economy is indeed constrained by resource limits, my second crisis, and environmental limits, my third crisis. So there are costs to water pollution, air pollution, noise pollution, net wetland change, net farmland change, net forest land. We've got to depreciate our capital asset stocks, and the most important ones that we have to depreciate and keep track of is our natural capital asset stocks that the whole economy, the whole economic infrastructure is built upon. This changes our policy signals, our policy cues to really put values into things like ecological restoration versus unwise development, to really question the path of suburbanization, right, versus controlled growth or growth corridors or growth boundaries. It really sort of tips everything on its head and gets us to start thinking about the costs of growth and not just myopically that any growth is good growth. And GPI also looks at the social foundations of genuine progress, right? It adds back in things that aren't included to begin with. So that value of household work, that value of volunteer work, the sort of positive externalities that you get from higher education investments, the cost of crime, the cost of family changes, divorce rate in this country. We have the highest divorce rate of any industrialized country. It's been part of our economic success story. High divorce rate, family breakup has been fantastic for our economy. Should it be good for our well-being? Should it be good for our progress as a society, right? So all these things mixed together, a whole bunch of different disciplines and methodologies and assessments and valuations and number counting. And through the years, we've created an accounting system over the last 25 years. It first was called the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, which is a more accurate description, because we're really looking at just the economic welfare piece of the puzzle. And we've done studies, ecological economists have done studies now in upwards of 20, 25 different countries across the world. The U.S., here's an old study of the U.S., grow, grow, grow. If you look at the ISEW, the precursor to GPI, we've been in a recession since about 1976. The United Kingdom, Austria lasted a little longer, Germany, the Netherlands, even Sweden has seen a sort of recent divergence between GDP and ISEW or GPI. If you look at the U.S. model in a little more detail, there was a group called Redefining Progress out of San Francisco that's really took it upon themselves to start to standardize this metric of genuine progress. And again, you see GDP growing through all of these administrations, some wiggles and some ups and downs here and there, but GPI really peaking in the mid-70s and being very flat ever since. And this mirrors a lot of other data on subjective well-being, data on happiness research, and asking people how they're doing or how the life satisfaction scores. We've grown our economy like crazy, but all of these happiness scores and a myriad of social science studies since the 1950s have shown flat or declining happiness. So what are we getting out of all this growth anyway? It's like, forget about the resource limit side, right? Are we any happier for bigger homes, longer commutes, failing schools? Like, this is making us happy, right? Yes? No? Maybe? We've started to drill down and look at this at the state level. A lot of the push from ecological economics early on was Washington, D.C. focused, really to sort of get the Bureau of Economic Analysis to change some of its metrics, to do green accounting, to do capital asset depreciation, to really sort of retool their books. We've given up. We're not getting very far in Washington, D.C. circles. So we started to look at the states. And a good place to start is in Vermont, our home state, where the University of Vermont is, where the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics is. We grabbed a whole bunch of students and we tasked them out to all of these 26 different indicators, worked with all of the NGO and the state agencies and the local governments and the county governments and the state government, and we said, we got a whole workforce of students, and over a semester's time in this peer-reviewed publication, we calculated for the first time a state GPI, a state genuine progress indicator. The politics weren't right, the timing weren't right. We didn't get anywhere with this almost 10 years ago now. Maryland, however, followed our lead. The governor of Maryland about 4 years ago decided that the executive branch of the government was going to push for this, and they developed a Maryland Genuine Progress Indicator, and they use it now with policy analysis. They're looking at programs around green job creation. They're looking at their smart growth policies. They're looking at their natural resource conservation policies. And they're using GPI as a lens to consider both the benefits and the costs of development. We recently got together with a group of other states that are now working on GPI, and there's about a dozen of them right now, hosted by the governor of Maryland this past October, to really start to look at how could we get 12, 15, 20, 25 states doing GPI studies, tracking GPI, and then we'll start to push on the national government from the state side of the equation. Vermont, finally, I would say, passed a law this past May, and we now are required as a state to generate genuine progress indicator with the intent to balance the economic, environmental, and social benefits and costs, to have it compared against our gross state product and see if gross state product is actually producing well-being where the costs don't outweigh the benefits. GPI, as I've been explaining, is this notion of net contributions of economic activity. It was tough to get this language in there. It really looks at adjustments to gross state product that account for both the positive and negative economic, environmental, and social attributes of economic development. So as the Vermont economy grows, are we growing in a way that looks like development, or are we growing in a way that looks like uneconomic growth, where the costs, which we usually don't count, outweigh the benefits, which we count all the time? The intent of this law is not just to simply have a new accounting system, but to use it in budgetary decisions, outcomes-based budgeting, measuring progress and application of policy and programs, serving as a tool to identify public policy priorities. This gives conservation a seat at the table. This gives energy efficiency a seat at the table. This gets all of our social concerns around volunteerism and parental policy and parental leave a seat at the table. This is changing the policy discussion in a little state like Vermont, so that we can really move towards development-based model and away from a growth-based model. So I'd love to take a few questions, but I hope I delivered on this grandiose title. I wasn't quite sure I'd get there, but we're trying to move to an economic system that really sort of values shared prosperity and recognizes our finite world, One big, bold step, I think, in the right direction, and it's a transitional step, is to change our accounting system and then tie that back to new policies. And I'd love to talk about either of those things in more detail. So thank you very much. So starting here with the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Right here. All right.
Dr. Erickson, one of the things I noticed that was missing from your discussion that was evident in Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth was talking about the topic of reproductive rates in the world. And I noticed you kind of totally missed that. And I think that's one thing people need to hit on as far as that's part of economics.
Absolutely.
We cannot sustain a continual world reproductive rates the way they are. And by addressing that issue, I think a lot of the other issues will disappear then. And that's one of the things I was very proud of Al Gore mentioning in his Oscar award-winning film, is he covered that particular topic. He had the guts to do that and wasn't afraid to do that.
Yep.
I've got both a bachelor's and master's in mathematics, MBA in marketing, so I've got a good bit of background. I was working on a PhD and gave up on that. It was a little bit too boring. But
So, John,
I find that missing in your discussion.
It is missing, and not on purpose, just simply out of prioritizing a discussion around economics here versus population growth. I got a whole other talk that I give about population growth, looking at some of the projections, looking at the great work that connects population growth and the demographics to what the world can handle, the carrying capacity of the planet. We're seeing some good news on the population front, as the demographers really think that we might be leveling out at the 9 billion range. It's in that range of 9 to 12 billion. The truth of the matter is if the world is aspiring to the consumption levels of Americans, the consumption level of Europeans, the overpopulated continents on this world right now are in the West, are in the developed world. Absolutely, population growth is the primary environmental problem in the developing world, but the primary contributor to resource depletion, water pollution, air pollution, carbon dioxide pollution, greenhouse gas warming, really comes from the developed side of the equation. So I chose to focus instead on that, but you're absolutely right. Lower population growth rate, stabilizing population, shrinking population is a big part of the solution side. We have a meeting that's been going around the world now that's called degrowth, that's looking at degrowing the world's economies, and we're also looking at degrowing the world's populations. It's really hard to, so I'll just leave it there. And thank you for that point. Yes?
The GPI, GPD law in Vermont creates a new paradigm for the way the legislature approaches issues or the way the administrative policymakers approach.
So Maryland went down the road of an executive branch side. It was really the governor's idea, the governor's baby, to go towards a genuine progress indicator. Vermont is the first state now to do this from the legislative side. So we've actually passed a law. And that was a harder road to take, right? And so now we've got the Senate and Assembly side in Vermont, right, that have a law. In fact, this law was passed this past May. It charged the Gund Institute to do this work as a preliminary assessment, and that report is due to the legislature next week. So I'll be working on this evening in the hotel room. That's sort of stage one. We are charged to work directly with the executive branch, so the Secretary of Administration, to start to incorporate that GPI into policy. We've talked about the notion, for example, of a GPI note. So we have an economist who works for the legislative branch who produces fiscal notes for bills. What would a GPI note look like? And would they tell the same story? The executive branch of the government hasn't wholeheartedly embraced this, but they themselves, just after the GPI law, decided to create their own indicator set and their own dashboard and their own set of numbers and put it up on the website. And that's great, because that's the point, right? We need a more pluralistic view. It doesn't have to be boiled down to one number. And so the governor now has his own dashboard which really has this sort of intention of the GPI behind it. Yes, and then here.
I have a question about, I understand the mathematics of it and the need to kind of get policies established, but it also seems like a top-down kind of model, whereas the households, John and Jane Doe, are kind of left waiting for the formula to catch up to them or become relevant to them. So is there something in Vermont that's happening or Maryland that's happening right now that is kind of getting into the households in layman's language?
There's a number of complementary projects that are ongoing right now in Vermont. You're absolutely right. This is geared towards changing the kind of macroeconomic climate, the macroeconomic discussion. So one of the very first things we're using GPI to look at in Vermont is to analyze our comprehensive energy plan. Our governor passed a plan that commits Vermont to 90% renewables by the year 2050. What does that look like through a GPI lens versus a gross state product lens? So it's really at that level, at macroeconomics, that GPI was designed to look. We've done GPI for the county level, we've also done GPI for the city level. But we just don't have good data at those scales to do all those kinds of calculations. It's really only at the national and state level right now. But passing the GPI bill has helped change the conversation. So what we have now is the GPI effort is part of a larger Vermont effort with NGOs, with local towns, with municipal governments that are looking at a broad selection of indicators. We're working with a number of NGOs that are really trying to understand how do we get to better budgeting decisions. How do we look at our government budgets much like we look at our household budgets? How do we move towards outcomes-based budgeting? How do we actually go out and survey and poll the public and to get their direct sort of year-to-year take on how they are doing emotionally and physically and their health? Because that qualitative information has to be put up against GPI as well. So we're taking kind of a multi-pronged approach right now, and I'd love to get into all of those different layers. GPI is only one of them, and it's intended to be that macro level focus.
Two quick things, and by the way, this is we have a beginning microeconomics class in here. Remember some of these words; they'll come up again. Would I be correct in saying that GPI essentially takes externalities, the costs that we've never paid before, and just forces it back in?
As part of it, so all those costs you saw in the middle column is classic kind of, how do we sort of value these external costs to economic activity?
Okay, and GPI basically tries to bring that back in and sort of reprice.
Yeah.
As a practical matter, though, I think so much of our problems today come from rent-seeking behavior being rewarded greatly. It makes all the sense in the world to do this, but so many policies and even practices today are self-destructive, but there are short-term profits to be made from it. As a practical matter, how does this translate back into behavior? How do we get changes in behavior from this?
So all this becomes is a policy guide.
Right. So we've just started a project looking at forest policy in Vermont and trying to see what kind of incentives are built into our tax code, what kind of incentives are built into our forest valuation standards, what kind of incentives are built into our energy planning, which is really going to kind of a biomass base. How are those incentives aligned or not aligned with a genuine progress indicator? Gross state product is simply price times quantity consumption. It's one lens to look at the impacts of a particular policy on jobs, on debt, on all the traditionally measured things. What GPI does is it gives you sort of a full cost estimate, right? Kind of a net benefit estimate of any particular policy. The policies themselves are where the sort of incentives and motivations and whatnot have to happen. So I mentioned the goal of 90% renewables by 2050. Well, that's just a goal. There has to be policy behind reaching that goal. Vermont has one of the largest electric utilities that is a utility devoted to the production of negawatts, right? Getting rid of power demand. So it's called energy efficiency. And basically, right now, Vermont is consuming less electricity than we are right now in 2013 than we were 15 years ago. Yet our economy has grown. So that's the kind of policy-focused change and the kind of instrument that we could use. by saying, we're going to put a little charge on each of your bills, we're going to put it towards energy efficiency. In a GSP model, that doesn't look so good. In a GPI model, it looks like a win-win. So we could get into lots of, I think, policy scenarios and policy stories for exactly that reason. Yes, down here.
I'm under the impression that they're driving hydrogen cars, hydrogen fuel cars in California right now, and that they're working on how an infrastructure would work. It seems like hydrogen fuel would change a lot, would change your numbers a lot, and it wasn't mentioned, and I'm wondering why.
It could. So underlying assumption of that one metric of depletion of non-renewable resources, how we do the cost of that is we replace, what's the replacement cost of using a renewable resource. And so right now at the state level, we're looking at this sort of spread of non-renewables versus renewables and taking the charge of every time we deplete a non-renewable resource, we want to make a deduction. But to value that, we're doing it at the cost of, is this making sense? We're doing it at the cost of replacing it with a renewable. Hydro fuels are not on the table in Vermont. Hydrogen fuels have interesting characteristics around energy return and energy invested. You need really cheap energy to make hydrogen fuels work. You can make hydrogen fuels from solar, you can make hydrogen fuels from hydro. Hydro is probably the best bet because of the huge ratio, the 100-to-1, right? Some of the places in the world where hydrogen-fueled economy has the best shot of going is, for example, in Iceland, where they use, I've got a project right now, a GPI project in Iceland, and that's a major scenario for them. They're basically looking to replace their entire dependence on fossil fuels and go into an entirely renewable-based economy built on geothermal, hydro, and hydrogen fuels. So they're trying within the period of about 15 years to go to entirely hydrogen-fueled car fleet, where the hydrogen is made from geothermal. And geothermal in Iceland is different than here, right? You just poke a hole in the ground, boom, there's hot lava, you know. It's like, it's cheap, it's really cheap. It's so cheap, it's so incredibly cheap in Iceland that it's become the world's sort of center for aluminum production. They ship raw aluminum ore from Australia all the way to Iceland to smelt it because energy is so cheap. Yes, back here.
Sure, I'd love to.
Yes, Dr. Erickson, I'm a little familiar with the state of Vermont. Could you comment a little bit on how GPI would be used to assess the impact of the industrial wind projects going on there versus the deforestation going on there?
So there's trade-offs in any kind of energy choice, right? I'm not exactly sure how it will pan out for a particular energy technology, but you know, when you put in a technology like wind and you lose a chunk of forest for the wind towers, GPI is going to count a benefit over here, it's going to count a cost over here. The question is what is the net, right? Vermont is in a kind of interesting space right now, and you saw wind up there in terms of energy return on invested. It's not all that bad as compared to a lot of the other energy technologies that we're putting a lot of money into. But Vermont is in a tricky spot right now where environmental groups are pitted against other environmental groups around wind. And it's gotten to that point where we have to make really tough choices around the trade-offs we're willing to make. I think the biggest trade-off and the biggest choice that we need to make is reducing our overall consumption. If we're going to start putting in wind and industrialize our landscape just so that we can continue on the growth path that I showed you here, I don't think the trade-off's worth it. If we can reduce our overall consumption and replace that piece of consumption that is highly dependent on non-renewable resources, then I think that trade-off's worth it. To put in more wind so that we can sprawl further, build bigger homes, go the longer commutes, what are we doing, right? That's desperation. And when you talk to one of our colleagues from, I think, the Sierra Club's coming, right, to talk about fracking, you know, the kind of trade-offs that we're talking about making for fracking, we really have to hold that up against, is this the kind of, are we that addicted to a consumer culture, and are we that much more happy that we are now in 2012 than we were in 1970 with an economy that was half the size? So I think that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you.